see the clip itself, because it's so 1970s Judaism. It's really great. Vera, do you have the clip? You want to put it just in the chat in case people want to see it? It's just like, it's a moment in time. Okay, welcome everybody to our Mishnah class. I had a very stressful morning because I was trying to negotiate two competing religious instincts or impulses that I have, and one of them won out. So the first religious instinct I have is like when we study the Mishnah, it's called the Seder HaMishnah, the order of the Mishnah. We have to move through one at a time. We're not actually looking at every one, but we have to move in the order of the Mishnah. And part of the purpose of this class is to just have us in regular Mishnah study and to begin to feel the literature as it unfolds, as it actually proceeds, and as it has been arranged. It was very particularly arranged. The Mishnah, of all things, is referred to as a Seder, an order. So I feel like we should really move through the Mishnah one at a time, and where we have been moving lately is through the first Mishnayot in Tractate Psachim that deals with Passover laws, and we should keep doing that. And not only should we keep doing that, I had a perfect little class prepared. I was really excited about the next Mishnah we were going to learn, and I had a whole little, I did a lot of research, and I figured out a cool thing. And then I realized late last night that today is BiShvat. Today is a Jewish holiday. I mean, it's a minor Jewish holiday, but it's a Jewish holiday, and it's one that actually has grown more major as in recent years, especially insofar as it's become a kind of holding place for Jewish environmental concerns. BiShvat is, as we'll soon see, famously the birthday of the trees, or Arbor Day, or the New Year of the trees, as the actual original formulation has it. And the other religious kind of rabbinic teaching impulse I have is that, if it's BiShvat, we have to study something related to BiShvat. We have to actually honor the day that is upon us, and to take a little break from our regular order of Mishnah study, which we've done in the past. When it was Hanukkah, we did a class on Hanukkah. We take little breaks here and there to honor the day. And I felt like, oh gosh, I gotta do that as well. And I thought, well, maybe not. BiShvat's not a big deal, right? It's just a tiny little holiday. There's no real official observance for it anymore. You could just blow by it and not even notice. But I decided in the end, we have to study BiShvat. And we have to study BiShvat today, not just because today is BiShvat, and it's just good to clarify what BiShvat is for our own Jewish knowledge. That is, after all, one of the goals of this class, is just building our knowledge, our Jewish knowledge. But we have to study BiShvat in particular, because BiShvat, this funny name, which we'll soon explain, it was BiShvat. It's almost like, doesn't even sound like sounds like a doesn't sound like a named holiday. BiShvat, that formula actually appears for the first time in the Mishnah. The Mishnah, the text that we study together, is the text that gives us BiShvat. And so we often study this Mishnah we're about to take a look at on BiShvat, and so it's worth doing so today. But I also didn't want to. Now I'm just talking out all my teaching anxieties, so just forgive me. But I also didn't want to go and rehash the same old BiShvat lesson that I've taught a million times. So I scrambled last night and this morning to try and figure out if I could think of anything new and interesting to say about BiShvat, and I think I did. So let's just see how it goes, okay? All right, so let's say a blessing, and then we will get into BiShvat. We're taking a break, and next week we'll come back to Chametz. And if you want to keep your mind on theme, there is something of a connection between our discussions over the last weeks around chametz and what we're looking at today, and that is, in both cases, in both all of the conversations we've had about chametz and eating chametz on Pesach, we've been thinking about what it means to regulate, to restrict, to moderate our consumption, our actual, our actual consumption, eating, consuming. And Tu BiShvat will take us along those same points of consideration, those same themes. So still thinking about regulating our consumption. And let's say a blessing, and then we'll see what Tu BiShvat has to say about all that. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, so like I said, the first Mishnah that we're going to look at today is the origin for the very notion that there is a Tu BiShvat. What is Tu BiShvat? Well, we're soon going to find out. It's a very well-known Mishnah, not just for Tu BiShvat's sake. It's very well-known also because it is, there's a link for you in the chat, it is the first Mishnah in Tractate Rosh Hashanah. And we're studying Tractate Psachim, the laws of Passover. Rosh Hashanah comes later in this section of the Mishnah, in this order of the Mishnah. So we'll eventually get to this Mishnah, and we could study it with, and we probably will when we get to it. We'll study it with Rosh Hashanah in mind, because that's a big holiday, that's a big deal, and that's the first Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah. So we have to think about that. But tucked in right there at the end is suddenly Tu BiShvat appears. So let's take a look at the appearance of Tu BiShvat, and then we'll try to make sense of the meaning of Tu BiShvat. And I guess part of what we always struggle with, last thing I'll say before we look at the Mishnah, is that Tu BiShvat, as it first appears, doesn't seem to be that meaningful. It seems to be more technical than anything else. So let's take a look. Okay, so here is the... Okay, here's the first Mishnah in Tractate Rosh Hashanah. Arba Roshei Shanim Hem. This is it's a famous and kind of funny opening to Tractate Rosh Hashanah, because what does Rosh Hashanah mean? The head of the year, the new year, and we have a holiday, Rosh Hashanah. So it comes as something of a surprise to hear the opening statement of the Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah is that Arba Rosh Hashanim Heim. There are 4 new years. So Rosh Hashanah, the one that we celebrate with the blast of the shofar, that's just one of 4. Oh, okay. So now Rosh Hashanah means something different than we thought it meant. We thought it was the name of a holiday, or at least I would have thought it was the name of the holiday. And it turns out it just literally means the beginning of a year. And there are 4 beginnings to the year, 4 beginnings. And now, if that sounds a little funny, just quickly remind you that in our own year, there are many beginnings to the year, right? There's the financial year, there's the academic year, there's tax season. And actually, tax season in some ways will be a good one to keep in mind, because some of the beginnings here will feel a little bit like taxes. So let's take a look at the 4 Rosh Hashanahs, one of which, of course, will be our Rosh Hashanah, which we celebrate in the fall in the month of Tishrei. You'll see that month come up. But before that, there are other Rosh Hashanahs. So on the 1st of Sivan, Sivan is the 3rd month of the year if you start from Passover. And this is part of what's confusing about this Mishnah and about the whole concept of Rosh Hashanah, is that the Torah counts the years from Nisan, from Passover. In fact, the Torah doesn't even have the name Nisan in it. that's a Babylonian name that they adopted later. And part of what we're dealing with here as we set the calendar, what the rabbis are dealing with, is how to integrate the biblical calendar with all the other calendars that are around them, just like we do, right? Just like we have the Gregorian calendar and we have the Jewish calendar. We think of New Year in both ways, right? Usually we have some sense there. So it is with them. Okay, so in the Torah, it just says the first month, the second month, the third month. The first month is the Passover month. That's the new year. That's the year that the Torah is recognizing. Rabbis have some more new years for us. Okay, so the first of Sivan is Rosh Hashanah for kings and for the festivals. Okay. So what does that mean? Well, that means we're not going to get too caught up in it today, but the one of the ways that they recorded time in the ancient world was by recording how many years it had been since the reign of a certain king. And you'll see that often in the books of the prophets, that there are, in the 40th year of the reign or in the 4th year of the reign of this king, these events took place. And what they're saying is we mark that when it is in the cycle of a king's reign, we mark that at the beginning of Sivan. That is the custom for marking a king's reign. Okay. It's also the case that we mark the festivals, the cycle of the festivals, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 festivals at the beginning of Sivan as well. Okay, neither of those things will be too important for us, but it's an example of a new year that starts not in the fall nor at Passover, but a couple months later, the first of Sivan. Okay, let's see what other new years we have. On the first of Elul, you will probably have heard of as the month that comes before Rosh Hashanah. It's the preparatory month. But here, Elul is its own Rosh Hashanah. Elul is Rosh Hashanah for the animal tithe. And Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon hold that it's on the first of Tishrei. Okay, this is another. Now, I'm not going to get too bogged down here, but let's explain these pieces as we go. You are obligated to give a tithe, a tenth of your livestock. If you have 10, goats that are born in a year, you have to give one of them to God, to the sanctuary, to the priests. So you tithe. Okay. How do you know how many animals you have to give? Well, it's a tenth of all the animals that were born in that year. So when do you mark the year? The first of Elul. The first of Elul, which is we often think of as the last month of the year, or the month just before Tishrei. And again, according to the Torah's counting, it's the 6th month of the year. But for our purposes, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. What's really important here is that the tithing of animals there's a cycle for the birth of animals, and we mark that by the first of Elul. And as you can see, there's some debate. So it's not like these are official God's word. This is how we measure the tithes. It's like some people did it this way, some people did it this way. The rabbis are debating, when do you mark the season of birthing of animals? And I don't know much about animal husbandry, so I can't say if there's any rhyme or reason to that. But that's the date. And if you feel like there's something actuarial, something like almost like an almanac here, you are quite correct. And Tu BiShvat is initially going to have that feeling as well. Okay, so something just like a very technical. So the animal tithe is marked by the first of Elul, and let's keep going. Now, on the first of Tishrei, which is what we mark as the new year. Tishrei is like, think of it like September. If you're not as familiar with the Hebrew calendar, around September, we always celebrate Rosh Hashanah. So the first of Tishrei is Rosh Hashanah for years. That's a very funny phrasing. there are all these new years, and one is the new year for years, which is just a way of saying there are many ways in which we track the years, but one of them is just like the calendar. And there's some debate among the commentators over whether this just means that it was the beginning of the year for like the way that January is the beginning of our year. It was common to mark the year that way, in which case it's a very non-sacred marking, but it's an acknowledgement that we also follow the general calendar year. Okay. Or does this have spiritual significance? And it really is the first we should observe it as the first of our year in a sacred way. Okay, so there's some debate over that, and we'll talk more about that as we go. So, but what's important is one of our new years is Rosh Hashanah, is what we call Rosh Hashanah, the first of Tishrei. Okay, and now that's true for years. It's also true for sabbatical and jubilee cycles. Okay, I'll remind you that there are cycles of 7 years in the Torah's calendar, and in every 7th year, the land is laid fallow. We do not work the land, harvest the land, farm the land. Okay, so when do you mark when the 7th year is begun? What we would call Rosh Hashanah. Same one that we mark the calendar on. We mark the sabbatical and jubilee cycle. Jubilee is 7 times 7, and then there's like a great, grand, glorious jubilee year, which has, release from all bondage, lots of interesting things that happen in the jubilee year. That is also marked in the fall at the beginning of Tishrei. Okay, and now this is in some ways the easiest to get confused around, because in our BiShvat conversation, because this seems similar, is that it's also true that for planting and for vegetables, the first of Tishrei is the new year. Okay. Now, it's going to be important for us to distinguish between vegetables and fruits. That's actually going to matter. By which I mean vegetables, as we say in our blessing, pri ha'adama, the fruits of the ground, and then pri ha'etz, the fruits of the tree. Those are 2 different categories in our blessings, and as you'll see, they're different categories in the ways that we mark the year and in tithing. And it's very clear that the rabbis and maybe the biblical vision, but even before the rabbis, really saw a difference between the fruit of a tree and how you thought of it, measured it, marked it, and then the fruit of the ground. So when you're tithing vegetables, which you have to, or grain or produce, anything that comes up out of the ground, you would mark it by the first of the year, what we call Rosh Hashanah, the first of Tishrei, the first of that fall month in the year. Okay, that's for vegetables. But for fruits, that is, fruits that come off a tree, there's a different date, and that is, well, it's a debate. On the first of Shvat. Now, when is Shvat? Well, Shvat is right now. Today is BiShvat. Okay, so that gives you, it's right at it's basically the first of January. It's the first of what we would consider like a calendar year, a Gregorian year. So on the first of Shvat is Rosh Hashanah for trees, and there we have it. Except that there's a debate, because that's according to the house of Shammai. The house of Hillel holds that it is the 15th of Shvat. The 15th of Shvat. Okay. So is it for trees, is it the first of the month or is it the 15th of the month? And those are both reasonable marker points, the first and the middle of the month. And they're also you'll see that Jewish holidays are either on the first of the month, Rosh Hashanah, or the middle of the month, Passover, Sukkot. Okay, so there's a debate. And remember, the rabbis are just sort of picking dates here. I don't want to say just picking, but they're recording like non-sacred, more like actuarial traditions. And Shammai says it's the 1st of January / Shvat, and Hillel says it's the 15th. And if you know rabbinic debate, then you know that in our tradition, we always hold like Hillel, almost always. Hillel almost always wins. And so he wins here. And so we hold that it's the 15th. And just for those of you who some of you will not care about the Hebrew here, and some of you will already know it. But for those in the middle category, let's just speak this out. The 15th of Shvat, here it's all written out, Bechamisha Asar. But the 15th in Hebrew, let's see, am I in Hebrew here? No, I'm in English. In Hebrew, letters can form numbers, and the 15th would be formed this way, 9 and 6, and 6. And you can see that's 15, and if you pronounced it, it would be 2, tet, u, the u sound. Okay, so that's just that's where you get tu BiShvat. 2 means the 15th. Okay, so the 15th of Shvat is Rosh Hashanah for the trees. Okay, I know I've been talking the whole time, and I know it's all been very technical, and soon we'll do a little more big picture thinking, but just one last kind of run through the technical aspect here. What does it mean to say that the 15th of Shvat is the new year for trees? It's sort of strange. Like, is it trees will be celebrating the new year? No. Like, we have come to think of it almost as like Arbor Day. Is it a day to respect and honor trees? That seems like a more modern formulation. What does it mean to say that it's the New Year's for the trees? Well, in the context of the Mishnah here, again, just like the vegetables and just like the animals, so the trees have the date that you use to determine whether growth has happened, or how much has growth has happened in a year. Okay. Now, the growth of fruit, as I said, fruit from trees is different than the growth of vegetables, in part because unlike vegetables, which are planted in the ground and then come out of the ground, when it comes to fruit trees, the tree is already there, and we're waiting for the tree to fruit. Okay, and so it's different than the time the tree was planted. It's the time the tree is fruiting, and we mark the fruiting of the tree for the purpose of tithing. We mark the fruit of the tree from the 15th of Shvat. Okay, that's from the purpose of tithing, and it's true that we tithe fruit just in the way that we tithe vegetables, and as we also tithe animals. We give a part of all of our goods and our produce to the temple, to God. Okay. That's the setup, and that's Tu BiShvat, and Tu BiShvat is the 15th of Shvat, the day that we use to mark how much fruit has grown on a tree, or whether fruit has yet grown on a tree. Okay, whether fruit has yet grown on a tree. It's the 15th of Shvat. Has the tree fruited yet? And now, why does it matter? Why does it matter that we take note of the growth of a tree? Well, as I said, some of it is tithing, but there are other laws and probably other laws that deal with the growth of trees in our Torah. And probably the most important of them, for the purpose of Tu BiShvat, the purpose of marking the growth of fruit, is the law of Orla. Now, we studied this before, actually, earlier in our Mishnah cycle. Let's see if actually I can find it. The law of Orla state, well, we're going to look at it together, but let's see if I can find my old class on it. No, I can't find it randomly. Maybe you can find it, Vera, but I don't know. Okay, let's just look at the law itself. The law of Orla states that, where am I? What I get for trying to find something in the middle of class. Okay, the law of Orla. So this is, we'll just read this because this is important. This is where we see the applicability of Tu BiShvat. So the law of Orla is here in Leviticus. When you enter the land and plant any tree for food, you shall regard its fruit as forbidden. 3 years it shall be forbidden for you, not to be eaten. In the 4th year, its fruit shall be set aside for jubilation before the Eternal, and only in the 5th year may you use its fruit, that its yield to you may be increased. I, the Eternal, am your God. Okay, that's really important. That's really an important, once that's true, that when we enter into the land, the Holy Land, that you cannot, for the first 3 years any tree is planted, it'll grow fruit, but you can't eat its fruit. Then it sprouts fruit or gives forth fruit in the 4th year. That fruit has to be offered to God, and then in the 5th year you can eat its fruit. Okay, so now how do we know whether the fruit is the fruit of the 1st year or the 2nd year? Tu BiShvat. 2nd year or 3rd year? Tu BiShvat. The cycle of a tree fruiting is marked by Tu BiShvat, and that's important because, I mean, it's vitally important because you actually cannot eat from a tree, you cannot eat the fruit from a tree until it's gone through this cycle. And that's not true for vegetables, and it's not true for grains. It's a particular regulation around fruits, and that's part of why we have to monitor the actual, do you call it sprouting, fruiting of a tree, and that's why we have a specific date for it. Okay, we're halfway through class, and all we've done now so far is explain what Tu BiShvat is. Now, I want to take us to those are the basics. So those are the basics. I want to take us to a more interesting or a twist, to take us to on a bit of a twist here, and begin to think about potentially the spiritual or ethical significance of Tu BiShvat. But before I do, I've just said a lot of technical stuff. Are there any questions? Is anything unclear so far? Yael.
Well, Tu BiShvat is also a shift in the earth's vitality. I know we're not supposed to prune trees after Tu BiShvat, and Tu BiShvat is the time, even here, when you see the first blossoms of the fruit trees. So this is when the life force, the sap, starts running through the branches, which is why we're supposed to stop pruning. And so before that time, the tree is dormant, it's wintering. And so we're in a different season, even spiritually. And then when we see the blossoms of Tu BiShvat, then we stop pruning and we go into another spiritual chapter.
Great. Thank you for that, Yael, because it is important to speak out loud, as Yael did, that these designations around fruit and vegetable, these are not arbitrary, as I kept describing them as if they were almost arbitrary. Like, you just pick a date, you need a date. But there are reasons, and I think I hesitate to go too far, because if I'm ignorant about anything in the world, I'm just a city bumpkin, you know. So I don't really understand farming and planting and cycles. I'm just woefully ignorant. But Yael gives us some sense of the actual movement of trees in their growth and in their shift in sapping, and this tracks, Yael's comments tracks well with, when I looked at the commentaries, they would explain, why is Shvat the month for trees? So one of the famous commentaries says, well, most of the rains have now happened by this point, right? And then the rains are beginning to dry up, and the fruits will come after the rains. Again, I feel like I'm in a territory where I'm just faithfully communicating what the rabbis before me have said. The agriculture of it, I don't know, but the point that Yael's making is very well taken, which is that, yeah, there's some movement in the life of a tree and in its response to the seasons. And that's also what we're dealing with here, is some recognition of cycles, of agricultural cycles. Some of these new years were human institutions, like when we record a monarchy or when we simply record time. But some of them are clearly agriculturally driven, and the fruiting of a tree is certainly one of those things. So this moment in January or Shvat is a time when we're just beginning to head out of the darkest months, out of the wettest months, out of the winter months, and beginning to think about spring coming, be thinking about fruiting. And so it makes sense that we would think about the cycle of a tree's fruiting around this time. Okay? All right. Again, so far, though, very technical, because after all, we'll need to not eat the fruits we're not supposed to eat, and then offer the fruits we're supposed to offer, and then consume the fruits that we're supposed to consume. We'll need this date. Okay? Happy BiShvat, everybody. You know what I mean? It's like, okay, cool. Like sort of technical, and not only sort of technical, but now that we're not in the time of the temple in the land of Israel, it doesn't really matter anyway, does it? Well, some of these laws, like Orla, actually do still count if you're in Israel. So not all of these are temple regulated. Some of these are land regulated. And there are plenty of halachic authorities in Israel who are thinking about these questions all the time. But for us here most of us here in the diaspora, is anyone zooming in from Israel? For us, mostly, we're fine. We don't have to worry about this. Okay. All right. Any other questions before I move forward? I'm now poised to pounce. Okay. All right. So here's what I realized this year. Every BiShvat, this Mishnah comes up because it's the source for BiShvat, though often it's sort of a boring source for BiShvat. So then we quickly go to some more like, fanciful story about, Choni Hamagel and his relationship to the trees, and, or, Kabbalistic tree of life, kind of like, let's talk about that, shall we? Because after all, BiShvat has evolved. It appears initially here to be an agricultural marker point, almost like a tax or tithing indicator. Then eventually BiShvat becomes a kind of Kabbalistic marker point. Like trees as a symbol become very important to the mystical mind, especially in the 1500s. And if you've ever been to a BiShvat Seder, a meal structured around BiShvat, and the like various forms of fruits that you eat, that's all kind of mystically driven. And then, as I said, the latest evolution in BiShvat's sort of place in our people's consciousness is that, it became, once we had environmental crisis or aware of environmental crisis, BiShvat became a good holding place for those concerns. Let's think of the trees, respect the trees, honor the trees. But that's not really what it's about, is it? It's not really about caring about trees, is it? Well, I want to try and make the claim that there is something in even these very technical discussions that does push us to think about how we use, consume, honor, and how we relate to the natural world around us, and in particular, how we will be judged for how we relate to the natural world around us. And I use that word judged very specifically because here's the thing that I realized this year that I've never really taught before, which is there's the famous BiShvat Mishnah, the first Mishnah in Masechet Rosh Hashanah, 1:1, chapter 1, Mishnah 1. But if you go to chapter 1, Mishnah 2, there's another famous Mishnah, but we never teach it on BiShvat, but we should, because it also mentions trees. So the trees are mentioned in the first Mishnah, trees are mentioned again in the second Mishnah, and not just trees, but the fruit of trees. And so today I want to think about how these two, the BiShvat as the date, and then and then this second Mishnah that reflects on the significance of our relationship to trees. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself, so let's read the second Mishnah. Let's think about how they might be related. So here's another Mishnah, very glorious Mishnah that we usually don't teach on Tu BiShvat, or at least I don't. But I think having just mentioned the Rosh Hashanah for trees, it's significant that, again, 1-1, now we'll go to 1-2. Okay, there were 4 Rosh Hashanahs. Now, sort of picking up on that kind of rhythm, there are 4 points about prakim ha'olam nidon. At 4 points, the world is judged. Okay. Now, this is like the language of there being 4 points is sort of funny. It's almost like there are 4 things that the world is. There are 4 parts to the judgment of the world. And the most famous judgment is this one right here. Okay, this is the one that if we teach this Mishnah on Tu BiShvat, we teach this one for sure on Rosh Hashanah, because here's where we begin to get the themes of Rosh Hashanah. The first of Tishrei should be a time of judgment. But let's look at now 4 ways that the world is judged. At 4 points, the world is judged. On Passover, concerning produce. What does that mean? It means at the time of Passover, which is, after all, the putting grain into the ground, the planting season, we are judged on whether or not we receive a judgment determining whether or not we will have good produce from the year. And when I say produce, I mean stuff that comes out of the ground. I mean stuff that comes out of the ground because on Shavuot, which the rabbis call Atzeret, on Shavuot, we're judged concerning the fruits of the tree. Okay, there you have it. First Mishnah is Tu BiShvat. Second Mishnah mentions being judged on the fruits of the tree. And that is really what I want to spend the rest of our time thinking about today. What does it mean to be judged on the fruits of the tree? Now, again, it has a technical meaning, which is that on Passover, there's some sort of judgment that happens that determines, even as we plant our grains, whether we will have good produce coming out of the ground for the year. On Shavuot, there's some judgment that happens that determines whether we will have good fruit coming out of the trees for the year. Okay. Now the famous one is Rosh Hashanah. On Rosh Hashanah, meaning on Tishrei itself, all creatures pass before God like sheep. Okay. All I would say probably creatures, meaning like animals, humans, all beings. Obviously, plants have already been named, but now this is really about us. We pass before God like sheep, as it is stated, the one who fashions all their hearts alike, and who considers all their deeds. So God looks over us. God watches all our deeds. This is the kind of foundation for the idea that Rosh Hashanah is a season of reflection and repentance. And then finally, on the festival of Sukkot, they are judged concerning water. Okay? In other words, on Sukkot, there's some judgment that we receive that determines whether or not we will have a good rain that year. And if you have studied Sukkot before, you know that there's a festival of water drawing during Sukkot. You know that we start praying for rain on the last days of Sukkot. So it makes, and you know that just the way the year works, it makes sense that water starts coming around that time of year. So it makes sense that that would be the time in which we are thinking about water. But this Mishnah says something different, which is that we're judged on water around that time. And so now I want to just start to think together with you what it means to say that there are 4 sort of components, 4 things that we think about when we think about judgment or fortune or pleading for a good year. One of them is ourselves. And the other three are stuff that comes out of the ground, stuff that comes out of the trees, and water. Okay? All right. So let's just start thinking in that way. What does it mean to say that the primary forms of judgment, of determination, of pleading, of praying, other than for our own lives, our own beings, our own selves, are basically vegetables or grains, fruits, and water? Okay. Now, I said along the way that we think about water on Sukkot because the rains are coming. And I said along the way we think about planting things in the ground on Passover because it's the spring and it's the time of planting. Why do we think about fruit on Shavuot? Why do we think about fruit on Shavuot? Okay. Do you know? It's because on Shavuot, there is the famous fruit offering, the Bikurim. Shavuot is when the offering of the Bikurim is presented to the priest. Now, let me just give you that. I know I've been mostly just presenting so far, but with this last piece, we'll have enough to really sort of open the conversation. And the first fruits of Shavuot are mentioned famously in Deuteronomy chapter 26, and begin when you enter the land that the eternal your God is giving you as a heritage and you possess it and settle in it. You shall take some of every first fruit of the soil, which you harvest from the land that the eternal your God is giving you, put it in a basket, and go to the place where the eternal your God will choose to establish the divine name. You shall go to the priest in charge at that time, and you shall say to him, I acknowledge this day before the eternal your God that I have entered the land that the eternal swore to our ancestors to give us. Okay, so Shavuot this describes a ceremony that takes place on Shavuot. Shavuot is a time when we make an offering concerning the fruit of the tree. Okay. All right. Now we've got a lot of parts. Okay. So there's like, let me begin to invite people in to speculate on like what kind of scheme we've built here, where we've got all these different starts of the year. And one of them is the fruiting start of the year. Right? And we've got all these ways in which we're thinking about how we are judged, what it means to have a good year, to be favorably blessed. And the primary units are ourselves, the ground, the trees, and the water, right? And those are kind of, those markers are following the agricultural cycle: Passover, Shavuot, Sukkot. Okay. All right. I see Alexandra's got a hand up, so why don't I let her take over here? I put out a lot of pieces, and I sort of feel like when I do this, sometimes I make the mistake of like laying out all the pieces, and then I don't really have a good question, because what I really want to ask is like, so what do we make of this? Like, do you see any pattern in it here? Is there anything that is starting to emerge in terms of like thinking about our relationship to trees? Okay. Alexandra, will you start us off?
Hi, thank you so much for doing a BiShvat class. I love it. So I was thinking about like this calendar and how you were saying earlier about there's tax season, there's the academic year, there's all different years, and there are different goals we need to keep track of throughout the year. And there are different times within the year that we need to check in about those goals and then start again. And so I saw a pattern in this list, like the produce is linked to Passover, and that's the produce that it's faster than the fruit of the tree, and the people had to get out fast in Passover. So I don't know if this is like digging too hard for a connection, but that's what I came up with. But then Shavuot is the fruits of the tree, and Shavuot is when we get the Torah, and that's a long-term goal and a long-term commitment. And then all our hearts and deeds on Rosh Hashanah, and we have to keep track of our hearts and deeds. And then the water is like, okay, how do we spiritually, what are our spiritual goals after we have done the work on our hearts and our deeds? And how do we then use that work to keep track of our spiritual goals? So I am actually personally finding this a very useful calendar system that I might try to employ.
Okay, good. Alexandra is beginning to do some of this this work for us of sort of as she put it, to sort of see the spiritual implications of these cycles. And I do think that that's what that second Mishnah does for us. We so far, in the first Mishnah, it looks like we're just talking about marker points in the year, agricultural marking points, seasonal marking points. But by the time we get to that second Mishnah, talking about judging ourselves, and right at the center of it is our own Rosh Hashanah, then it's worth wondering, and I think it's fair to wonder, what are these other points of judgment have to do with us, with our spiritual life? What does it mean to say that there are 4 moments of judgment, of tshuva, of reflection, of contemplation, of spiritual reckoning? And one of them has to do with water, and one of them has to do with the ground, and one of them has to do with the trees. And we have a kind of a reckoning. We will be judged in some way on our relationship to the fruit of the tree. Okay? I think that's really fair to say. There's some way in which our relationship to trees is being monitored, and we will be judged on that. Okay, so let's continue to speak this out. Gary?
I find it interesting when we mention Sukkot and it's the time of the water. And this may get complicated, but when we recite the Shema in the second blessing, the usual English translation says, we pray for the rain in their proper times, is the English translation, but in Hebrew, it's the Yoreh, the Malkosh, the first rain and the last rain, which is an unusual construct in Hebrew that they have different words for that. And I found it interesting that Sukkot relates to the Yoreh, and it seems to be that when we get to Shavuot, the time for trees, we're relating to the Malkosh. And that has to do with the time of trees is the last rain. And we're syncing up these cycles of water, which give us blessing that the Sukkot rains enable things to grow, and the Malkosh rains able to sprout until we get to the next season. And it's the blessings we get just from the seasons and the water and the way the cycles go.
Good. Okay. Like in a sense, all of these features are overlaid, right? Water has to do with the growth of trees and growth from the ground, which then sustains us. There's some kind of, ecological cycle being described here. We have to, why does it matter? We're not just thinking about ourselves, we're thinking about the world around us because we are sustained by the world around us. And the cycle of water, for example, that Gary just laid out for us, the beginning of the rains and the end of the rains, that's, first of all, it affects the growth of the trees, but it's also a good example of the way in which we are spiritually, we have spiritual work to do around the rain. And in the case of rain, the work is we pray for rain. We acknowledge that God is the source of rain. We begin praying for the rains at a certain season, and we hope that our acknowledgement of God's blessing of rain will be responded to. We're kind of tuned in to the water cycle, and we're not just tuned into it, we give it as kind of a spiritual overlay, which is we see ourselves as requesting rain, and we do it when it's time to request rain. Okay? So now the question is, what is our spiritual relationship to fruit? What is our spiritual relationship to trees? How do we think about our use of, our non-use of, our offering of trees? What is the spiritual dynamic that our tradition wants to put us into in relationship to trees. All right, let's hear from Allison. Allison, are you there? We can't hear you.
I forgot to unmute, sorry.
Oh, great.
So I hope that I'm on topic enough, but when you brought up that we are being judged on our relationship with these things, what I thought about was actually the story of Cain and Abel. Because Cain brings an offering of, is it vegetables? It's a great farmer, and Abel brought an offering of animals. And, you know, famously, God was much happier with Abel's offering than Cain's. And I was reflecting on that yesterday, actually. I did like tree planting for BiShvat. I was just thinking about it, and I don't know what to make of it, except that we just have that example of offering like the fruit of the soil and God not being happy with it for some reason.
Oh, okay, good. So one of the ways that we can think about kind of splitting up our different sort of consumptions is to think about animal consumption and vegetable, fruit and vegetable consumption. Are we kind of people of agriculture, or are we people of shepherding, right? And there are lots of ways to think about that binary as it play, and Cain and Abel is the first place to start thinking about that. So we could have a whole class where we are exploring what our relationship to animals ought to look like. What is the Torah encouraging around our relationship to animals? And if we had that class, we would start right at the beginning where in the Garden of Eden, we are not allowed to eat animals, right? And then at the time of Noah, we are allowed to eat animals as a kind of a concession. We could have that whole conversation. And that is an important conversation. That's one way to do exactly the sort of work that I want to do right now with trees, to think about, it isn't just that the animals are there, but that we have to, there's some kind of watchful eye above us, monitoring how it is that we consume animals, whether we're allowed to consume animals, whether we overconsume animals, whether we consume animals in a way that brings them pain. Lots of conversations there about what it means to think about the spiritual dynamics of our relationship with animals, and whether indeed we should be allowed to eat animals, whether God allows us or judges us favorably in our consumption of animals. Now, what about trees? I see I only have a few minutes left, so let me speak some of this out, just so we have the case made. What is our spiritual relationship to trees? Well, let's just take a look at what we've seen so far. And just in the examples of, what are the laws that we are contemplating here? Well, one of the laws is that when you plant trees, you can't use them for several years. You have to let them grow strong and sturdy. And then you have to make an offering. And only in the 5th year can you eat trees. Now, look at the repetition in the language here. When you enter the land, you have to let the trees grow. And so it is that in the first fruits offering, same kind of language. When you enter the land that God is giving you, you have to offer the first fruits to God before you consume the fruit of the land. So the dynamic here that repeats itself in our relationship to trees is that you can have the fruit of the tree, but not right away. Not right away. Initially, you have to let the tree be. Initially, you have to think of the tree as belonging to God, as something that you cannot consume. Now, I just said, if we were thinking about animals, we would start with the Garden of Eden. Now, if we're thinking about a relationship to trees, where would we start? Garden of Eden as well. Garden of Eden as well. Because the very first mandate that we have in relationship to trees in the Garden of Eden is that the eternal God commanded the human, saying, of every tree of the garden, you are free to eat. But as for the tree of knowledge of good and bad, you must not eat of it. For as soon as you eat of it, you shall die. So with very little time left, let me just speak out what I think I'm seeing happen here, which is that again and again and again in our relationship to trees, but really going back to the very first, in some ways, the very first mandate humanity ever received is this dynamic of you can consume, but there are restrictions to your consumption. You can consume, but there are restrictions to your consumption. I was just saying that twice because I think that's the fundamental dynamic. And that is the fundamental dynamic from the very start that is marked by, of all things, our relationship to trees. I mean, the Garden of Eden uses the tree as the symbol, the very symbol of the constriction of our consumption. You can eat anything you want in the garden, but there are certain trees you cannot eat, okay? So it is that a certain theme gets set with trees, where every time we think about consuming trees, we have to first think about the ways that we do not consume trees, okay? And that pattern continues throughout the Torah and throughout Jewish legal tradition. And we can think of many examples where you are allowed to eat from the ground, but you also have to restrict the way you eat. The sabbatical year is certainly one of those institutions. The corner of the field is one of those institutions. There are many institutions in which we are being told that you can have the fruit of the tree, but not right away, not entirely. You must restrict your consumption of trees if you are going to be judged worthy of consuming trees. And the last example of that I want to put in front of you today on Tu BiShvat is the example that also is a famous teaching on Tu BiShvat, which is the example of the trees that can be destroyed in times of war and those trees that cannot be destroyed in times of war. And this is also in Deuteronomy. When you wage war against a city, you have to besiege it a long time in order to capture it. You must not destroy its trees. You may eat of them, but you must not cut them down. Okay, and then it says you can cut down certain trees, but not fruit trees. Okay, so again, there's usage that is allowed. There's consumption that is allowed. There's you can actually chop down a tree, but there are regulations. You cannot do so wantonly. You cannot do so destructively. And in fact, that last text, the one that suggests that we can cut down certain trees, but not other trees, we have to be thoughtful about the way that we cut down trees, becomes the source for the entire principle in Jewish law of not wasting, a principle known as bal tashchit. And Maimonides speaks it out. This is the last thing we'll look at today. Maimonides speaks it out here when he says it's not just trees, but anyone who breaks vessels, rips clothing, destroys a building, stops up a spring, or destroys food in a wantonly destructive manner violates the principle of you must not destroy. That principle, which we learn from not destroying trees. And what I mean to say by all of this, as we come to the end of our time, is that the tree is the symbol from the very start of the Torah. It is the kind of uber symbol of regulating your consumption. The tree is the thing that is forbidden in the Garden of Eden. And it becomes kind of like the very the sort of standing reminder to us that our consumption of the earth must be regulated. And so it's no surprise that we get our most environmentalist formulation in Jewish law, the idea of not over-consuming or being wasteful in our consumption. We get it from yet another regulation of how we can and cannot consume trees. Okay, so that is at least some indicator, I think, even in the first formulation of Tu BiShvat in the Mishnah, the fact that we move in the very second Mishnah to some language of being judged on a relationship with trees, it doesn't take long to start to think, oh, wait a minute, we're marking the cycle of trees because we're restricted in the trees that we can and cannot consume from, which after all is the very dynamic that we see every time we have regulations or laws around trees, and in fact, might just be the very first thing that we were ever regulated on. So with all that said, I think it's fair to say that Tu BiShvat, even in its earliest formulations, was an environmentalist holiday, because it is a holiday, and it's the holiday of the trees, and any evoking of trees in our tradition is an evoking of the need to constrict our consumption. Okay, so that's your Tu BiShvat class, and we'll return next week
Wonderful.
with more Passover.